I unholstered my sidearm, though I knew deep down that bullets would be entirely useless against whatever was happening here. I pushed open the heavy internal bulkhead door and stepped into the second car, the crew quarters. The transition was physically shocking. The pristine, cool air of the commander's car was instantly replaced by a blistering, suffocating heat. The air in this car was bone-dry, searing my throat with every breath, tasting faintly of sulfur and burnt copper. The flashlight beam cut through thick, floating clouds of static dust. I aimed my light at the floor, expecting to find the remains of the military escort. But there were no bodies. There were no skeletons. There were no uniforms. Lined up perfectly along the metal floor grating, right next to the rusted iron bunk beds, were 15 distinct conical piles of incredibly fine gray ash. It looked like powdered cement, completely undisturbed by any draft or vibration. They were positioned exactly where 15 men would have been standing or sitting. But the sheer terror of this car wasn't resting on the floor. The true horror was permanently branded onto the walls. As I swept my flashlight beam across the solid iron bulkheads, I stopped dead in my tracks. Burned deep into the metal panels were pitch-black, perfectly defined human silhouettes. They looked exactly like the permanent thermal shadows left behind by the victims of a nuclear flash. I slowly walked up to one of the dark shapes burned into the wall near the center of the car. It was the shadow of a tall man, his arms raised defensively over his head, his body contorted in a posture of unimaginable agony. I stared at the two-dimensional stain on the iron, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then the shadow moved. I violently stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking. It wasn't an illusion. The edges of the black silhouette were vibrating, blurring slightly against the metal. Very, very slowly, the burned-in shadow lowered its arms. It threw its two-dimensional head back, opening a formless, pitch-black mouth in a silent, eternal scream. They hadn't just been incinerated. The sudden, catastrophic temporal event that consumed this train had trapped their final milliseconds of agonizing death, looping it endlessly into the very molecular structure of the steel walls. The entire car was alive with their suffering. As I moved down the narrow aisle, trying desperately not to disturb the piles of ash on the floor, the shadows around me twitched and writhed in the harsh white light of my flashlight. I saw a shadow dragging itself across the ceiling. I saw another clawing frantically at the sealed windows, its blackened fingers permanently scraping against the iron. The psychological weight of the room was crushing. The laws of physics were rapidly breaking down the deeper I went. Tiny beads of moisture began to form on the walls, but instead of dripping down to the floor, they crawled upward, defying gravity, pooling on the ceiling. The dust in the air stopped floating randomly and began to slowly align into complex, shifting geometric grids. The oppressive heat pushed against my chest like a physical barrier, trying to force me to stay, trying to synchronize my heartbeat with the dying echoes of the 15 men who were trapped in a permanent state of being burned alive. I forced my legs to move, pushing through the thick, vibrating air toward the heavy door of the third and final car, the cargo hold. The coordinates I decrypted from the classified Soviet archives led me into the absolute dead center of the Siberian taiga. This is a place where modern navigation simply goes to die. For the last 48 hours, my magnetic compass has been spinning in endless, chaotic circles, and my satellite phone has been displaying nothing but a permanent, fatal signal error. According to the redacted documents, in the bitter winter of 1953, a highly classified transport unit known only as Special Train 214 vanished without a single trace in this exact sector. It was a massive, heavily armored locomotive carrying an undisclosed biological or physical anomaly from a deep underground research facility. The official military reports stated that the train derailed and sank entirely into the bottomless peat bogs during a violent storm. But they were lying. They always lie to cover their tracks. I fought through miles of dense, freezing fog and impenetrable pine forests, and I finally found it. Looming out of the thick, gray morning mist like a prehistoric leviathan, the armored train sat perfectly still in the middle of the ancient woods. It was an astonishing, terrifying sight. Thousands of tons of reinforced Soviet steel, covered in a thick, suffocating blanket of dark red rust and dead black moss. But the most unsettling detail wasn't its sheer, impossible size. It was the ground beneath it. There were absolutely no train tracks. The massive, corroded iron wheels were resting directly on the soft earth and pine needles. Tracks hadn't rotted away, they had never been built here. The train had simply manifested in the middle of a forest where no railway had ever existed. I stood there in the freezing mist, listening. There were no birds, no wind rustling the branches. There was only a profound, suffocating silence, broken by a very faint, ultra-low frequency hum vibrating directly from the iron hull. It was a sound you feel in your teeth rather than hear with your ears. I slowly approached the rear car, my boots crunching softly against the frozen dirt. The heavy steel door was sealed tight by a massive, rusted circular iron wheel, similar to a submarine hatch. The metal was freezing, burning right through the fabric of my heavy tactical gloves. I gripped the wheel with both hands, planting my boots into the dirt, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. The rust cracked and flaked off in sheets. The internal gears groaned with a sickening, metallic shriek that echoed endlessly through the dead forest. The heavy door finally gave way, swinging outward and revealing a pitch-black, silent void inside. I stepped over the massive iron threshold, turning on my chest-mounted tactical flashlight. The second my back boot cleared the frame, the heavy steel door violently slammed shut behind me on its own with a deafening, echoing crash. I was completely sealed inside. I swept my flashlight beam across the interior, and my mind violently rejected what my eyes were seeing. The outside of the train was a decaying, rusted corpse. But inside this first commander's car, time had simply ceased to exist. The walls were painted a pristine, glossy military green, untouched by a single speck of rust or moisture. The air smelled strongly of cheap, unfiltered tobacco and fresh machine oil. On the wooden desk in the corner, an old glass ashtray sat next to a stack of classified logs. A vintage Soviet cigarette was resting on the rim, and a thin, perfectly unbroken ribbon of blue smoke was steadily rising into the air, completely motionless. Next to it was a tin mug filled with hot black tea. I slowly reached out and held my hand over the rim. It was radiating intense heat. I looked up at the mechanical wall clock. The heavy second hand was loudly ticking. Tick, tick, tick. But it was moving backward. The sweep of the hand was impossibly smooth, carving away the seconds in reverse. I realized with a creeping sense of absolute horror that the atmosphere in this train wasn't preserved. It was stubbornly, violently refusing to move forward in time. I grabbed the heavy iron lever of the cargo door. It was shockingly cold, a massive contrast to the blistering heat of the crew quarters. I pulled it down and the door hissed open, breaking a vacuum seal. I stepped into the third car and immediately my boots lost contact with the floor. Gravity in this space had been completely neutralized. I grabbed the door frame to anchor myself, my flashlight beam sweeping across an area of absolute, zero-gravity chaos. The massive military transport crates that were meant to hold the anomaly had been violently ruptured from the inside out. Thick wooden planks, twisted iron hinges, and heavy brass artillery shells were floating suspended in the dead air, turning with agonizing slowness. It was a perfect, three-dimensional freeze frame of an explosion that never finished. I pulled myself forward, floating weightlessly through the debris field, gently pushing floating brass casings out of my face. In the exact center of the massive cargo car, hovering silently in the void, was the thing they had dug up. It wasn't a machine and it wasn't a weapon. It was a monolithic, jagged crystal structure, glowing with a deep, pulsating, bloody red internal light. It was surrounded by three massive, floating rings of solid lead, which were slowly orbiting the crystal like dead moons around a dying planet. The red light didn't just illuminate the room. It felt heavy, casting long, spinning, impossible shadows from the floating debris. The crystal was beating. Thump. A deep, seismic vibration rolled through the air. Thump. With every single pulse of the red light, the space around it warped and distorted, bending the floating wooden planks and warping the iron walls. I drifted toward a small, thick armored window on the side of the car and looked out. I expected to see the dark, misty trees of the Siberian taiga. But there was no forest. There was no sky. Outside the glass was a terrifying, infinite void of swirling gray static, torn apart by impossibly fast, blinding streaks of violet light. We were completely disconnected from the Earth. The train wasn't moving through geographical space. The pulsating crystal was dragging the entire massive iron structure violently through the fabric of time itself. Suddenly, the red light flared with a blinding intensity. The hum of the train pitched up into a deafening, bone-shattering mechanical scream. The crystal was preparing for a massive temporal jump. I realized in a flash of pure panic that if I was inside this car when the cycle fully reset, my physical body would be reduced to a pile of gray ash, and my shadow would join the screaming silhouettes in the next car for eternity. I kicked off the wall, swimming frantically through the zero-gravity air. I dodged a floating iron gear and violently crashed into the heavy side-loading door of the cargo bay. I smashed the emergency release latches with my fists, tearing the rusted bolts free. The heavy door blew outward, and I was violently sucked out into the blinding white void. I slammed hard into the ground, burying my face deep into freezing wet Arctic snow. The sudden return of gravity and freezing air knocked the wind out of my lungs. I scrambled to my hands and knees, gasping violently, and looked back at the tracks. The massive, rusted armored train was completely gone. The thick morning fog was slowly rolling back in, but the ground where the train had been sitting was permanently scarred. There was a perfectly straight, mile-long trench melted deep into the permafrost, glowing with a faint orange heat. The soil had been turned into smooth, smoking glass. With violently trembling hands, I raised my left arm and looked at my tactical GPS wrist monitor. The screen was heavily glitched, covered in static, casting a faint blue glow on the snow. The geographical coordinates were exactly the same, but the digital date flashing in the corner had changed. It read, "System error. Date shifted backward exactly 3 days. Train 214 is still traveling on its infinite looping track. And whatever destination that crystal is dragging it toward, it is the end of our time."